The 24th of April, 2018. Citrus Heights, California. The morning sun hit the driveway, and Joseph James DeAngelo stepped out to attend to his property. He moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had nothing but time. Neighbors walked their dogs past his fence, offering polite nods to the grandfather who spent his days tinkering in the garage. He was 72. He was quiet. He was entirely unremarkable. No one on this street suspected that the man watering his lawn was the architect of a 40-year nightmare. For decades, the name Golden State Killer had been a ghost story whispered in police stations and living rooms across the state. The Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, the original Night Stalker. These were not different men. They were him. The silence of his suburban life was a deliberate construction, a mask worn over a void. While the neighborhood slept, the man they thought they knew had been hunting. The truth was tucked into the foundations of his quiet life, waiting for the moment the police finally closed the distance. The monster was not hiding in the shadows. He was right here, in the light. The terror did not begin in a shadow. It began with a calculated violation of domestic space. In 1974, he started small, breaking into homes to rearrange furniture and steal small trinkets, a practice of control that soon grew darker. By 1975, the violence escalated with the murder of Claude Snelling. Then, he secured a position within the Auburn Police Department. He used the authority of the badge to mask his movements, ensuring he remained invisible while patrolling the very streets he intended to haunt. Over 50 rapes followed in Sacramento. He moved through the darkness with tactical precision, cutting phone lines to ensure isolation. He bound victims with knots learned from his training and whispered the name Bonnie into the silence of their homes. Every patrol shift was a cover for the next attack. He held the power of the law in one hand and a weapon in the other. He was the hunter and the shield, operating in plain sight while the city trusted the uniform. The betrayal was total. He was not just breaking into homes, he was breaking the trust of an entire community. The facade of the badge shattered in 1979. He was fired from the police force for shoplifting a hammer, a petty act that stripped away his primary cover. Without the uniform to shield him, his violence did not cease. It intensified. He moved his hunts south, leaving the Sacramento Valley for the coastal communities of Santa Barbara and Orange County. The transition was absolute. He stopped seeking only control or violation. He began seeking lives. 13 people were murdered in these new hunting grounds, their deaths marking the final, most brutal evolution of his reign. The pattern was no longer just about intrusion or terrorizing a household. It was about finality. He moved through these communities like a ghost, striking in the dark and vanishing before the sun could expose his tracks. Every crime scene became a permanent scar on the landscape of Southern California. For decades, these 13 lives would remain the focus of a desperate, stalled investigation. He had successfully transformed from a predator in the shadows to a phantom murderer whose reach seemed to cover the entire state. The terror was no longer a local fear. It had become an enduring, statewide epidemic of violence. The terror stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The phantom vanished, leaving behind a silence that was more terrifying than the crimes themselves. For 40 years, the trail went cold. Investigators pored over thousands of pages of case files, cross-referencing evidence that led to dead ends and false leads. The maps in police stations remained pinned with red string, but the lines never connected. Despair settled into the heart of the investigations. Families sat in living rooms, waiting for news that never came, their lives permanently altered by the violence that claimed their loved ones. The monster had effectively erased himself from the world. He remained at large, a secret hidden in plain sight, while the community lived under the weight of an unresolved nightmare. This wasn't just a failure of law enforcement. It was a lingering shadow that touched every home in California. Every unlocked door or creaking floorboard brought back the fear of the man who had once stalked the night. The victims were left to carry the burden of their trauma and isolation, their questions unanswered by the empty space where justice should have been. The state held its breath, waiting for a ghost that had stopped leaving footprints. The stalemate finally broke in 2017. Paul Holes looked at the stagnant evidence with a different perspective, turning away from traditional law enforcement databases toward the new frontier of genetic genealogy. It was a desperate gamble. He took the crime scene DNA, once thought to be a dead end, and uploaded the profile into a public genealogy website. The digital architecture of the site began to process the data, comparing strands of biological evidence against millions of user-submitted profiles. For weeks, the silence returned, but this time it was different. It was the silence of a system working. Then, the first notification hit. The database found matches with distant relatives, thin threads of genetic code connecting the monster to living people. The investigators moved with clinical focus, building out massive family trees and cross-referencing military records with geographic data from the years of the attacks. Every name was a potential target, every birth certificate a possible lead. The hunt had shifted from a search for a phantom to the methodical narrowing of a physical man. The tide was turning. For the first time in 4 decades, the investigators were no longer chasing a shadow, they were tracing a bloodline. The search narrowed to a single name: Joseph James DeAngelo. Surveillance teams moved into Citrus Heights, blending into the suburban landscape. They watched his driveway from unmarked cars, tracking the rhythm of his days. He lived in silence, a quiet grandfather tending to his garage, unaware that the eyes of the law were locked on his every move. The agents operated in a state of extreme tension. They were inches from a man responsible for decades of terror, yet they could not make a move. One mistake, one alert, and the suspect would vanish. They waited for him to step outside, for him to discard something, anything, that held his biological signature. Every morning, they observed him walking to his mailbox or puttering in the yard. They watched him handle trash, waiting for him to drop a coffee cup, a napkin, or a wrapper. The team sat in the heat, breath held, watching the mundane movements of a man who had once been a nightmare. Each hour that passed without a sample was an hour of agonizing patience. They needed the physical proof to turn a suspicion into a certainty. They waited for the trash to hit the curb. The confirmation arrived in the middle of the day. A lab report linked the DNA from the discarded item directly to the crime scene samples. The phantom was no longer a theory. The order came down instantly. Unmarked cars accelerated, blocking both ends of the street in Citrus Heights. The tactical team moved with coordinated speed, surrounding the property before the occupant realized the perimeter had been breached. They reached the front door, the heavy metal of their gear clashing against the silence of the suburb. There was no hesitation. They struck the house with overwhelming force. The man who had spent 40 years hiding in plain sight was caught entirely off guard in his own driveway. He did not run, he did not fight. He stood motionless as the officers closed the distance, their hands securing his wrists. The 40-year reign of the man once known as the Visalia ransacker and the East Area rapist ended in a quiet, manicured yard. The front door remained open, a stark frame for the final collapse of his carefully constructed life. For the first time, he was not the one in control. The interrogation room was cold, lit by the steady, unforgiving hum of fluorescent lights. DeAngelo sat in the center of the room, his body rigid and motionless against the hard plastic of the chair. He stared ahead, his gaze fixed on a point in the empty air. On the metal table sat a can of Dr. Pepper, a calculated placement by the investigators, intended to provoke a reaction. He did not touch it. He did not look at it. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, as the investigators waited for him to speak. For decades, he had spoken through violence, through threats, and through the shadows of his crimes. Now, he was stripped of that power. The walls of the room seemed to press inward, reflecting the finality of his capture. He shifted his weight, his fingers twitching once against the table's surface. He opened his mouth, his voice barely audible, a dry rasp that carried the weight of 40 years of secrets. He whispered, "I did all those things." The confession hung in the air, a final, hollow punctuation to a lifetime of terror. He did not look up. He simply stared. A man finally out of places to hide, his reign over. The courtroom floor was hard, unforgiving, and packed with the people he had spent decades trying to erase. They stood one by one, their voices filling the space, detailing the exact nature of the trauma he had inflicted. They looked directly at him, refusing to let him hide in the shadows of his own history. He sat in the defense box, diminished and small, a relic of a terror that had finally lost its teeth. The power had shifted. It was no longer his. Then, the silence deepened as his former fiancée, Bonnie, approached the stand. She stood before him, steady and unwavering. She did not scream. She did not reach out. She simply existed in the space he had once tried to dominate, a living testament to the life he had failed to destroy. He avoided her gaze, his head bowed, offering only a brief, hollow apology that vanished into the heavy air of the room. The survivors watched him, their collective presence stripping away the last remnants of his mask. He was no longer the monster of the night. He was a man sitting in a chair, confronted by the reality of his own pathetic end, forced to listen to the consequences of a lifetime spent in the dark. The gavel fell, sealing the sentence. Life without the possibility of parole. He was led away, disappearing behind heavy doors, leaving the courtroom to the light of day. But the impact of his capture rippled far beyond those walls. The method that finally broke the silenced genetic genealogy became the new standard for global law enforcement. Where he had once relied on the cover of darkness and the anonymity of a badge, investigators now wielded the precision of biological data. Since that day, over 150 suspects have been identified through the same digital trail he accidentally left behind. The era of the phantom criminal, the one who could vanish into the suburbs and live out a lifetime of secrets, came to a permanent end. Science reached into the past, connected the broken threads, and pulled the truth into the open. The case serves as a permanent landmark, a reminder that the tools of discovery have outpaced the methods of concealment. No matter how deep the shadow or how long the trail, the evidence now waits in the blood, in the cells, and in the family trees. The monster was exposed, the records were finalized, and the dark age of his reign was replaced by the cold, clear light of forensic certainty.